Welcome to Conversations Live. For more than a decade, we've brought you the best in books, entertainment, and current events. When the movers and shakers of the world have something to say to you, they say it to us first. Now, here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
And welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again, whether you're tuning in on the radio dial in Mississippi at WYAD 94.1 FM. We welcome you all back. Also, those joining us through our online affiliates around the world, we're glad to have all of you with us as well. We're excited to welcome Steve Rubin to our program today. Steve is not only an author and producer, but also a pop culture historian. That really comes into play with this brand new project that we're going to talk to him about. It's called the TWILIGHT ZONE Encyclopedia. We'll talk to Steve not only about his love of pop culture, but also what it's been like for him to do what he loves, and then, of course, to be able to share that with the rest of the world. And if you're just hearing about Steve and his book, we'll tell you at the end of our segment how you can be able to stay connected with both. But, Steve, hello to you, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Cyrus. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everybody in radio and digital land.
Well, look, I appreciate you, Steve. You know, you have had quite the varied career, and what's so great about you, when I thought about this when I was prepping for your segment, is that you've been able to not only, as I said, be able to do what you love when it comes to not only enjoying pop culture and all the great things that have come with it, but also being able to have a profession where you're able to bring projects to life as well. What has that been like for you, Steve, and not only to be able to have your passion become part of your profession?
Well, I consider myself very fortunate. So many of us work in jobs that we do to sustain ourselves and our family, and we're not in love with that job, but we do it because we earn a paycheck and we stay afloat. And I was very fortunate early in my career to take a love of movies and pop culture and translate it into an actual career. I mean, I couldn't start out as a writer making money. I mean, I wrote for many years for essentially free. But I took my passion and love for films, particularly, and I found a career doing it. In our world out here in Hollywood, it's very important to remember a key piece of advice that most veterans will tell you is keep your day job. Until you can sustain yourself on your creative activities, you must have a net. And so many of my friends and coworkers and people I've known over the years have gone off and tried to write movies or, direct or produce or do anything in creatively, and they didn't have that net. And because it takes so long to get something going, and as many as years, you get into trouble financially. And I think I early on realized that I needed to have a quote-unquote day job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what happened was I started my career writing about movies. I was a young film enthusiast. My mother saw all the movies when she was a kid, and I grew up across the street from a movie theater. So from the ages of, say, 7 to 10 or 11, I was at the movies every weekend and even in the evenings with my parents because I was an only child, and they took me along with them a lot of the times. And I just loved movies, and I studied history in college. I loved history. I always liked an assembly of facts and what they mean. And when I got out of college, I decided to become a freelance writer. And I had become a subscriber to a magazine in Chicago called Cinefantastique. Now, Cinefantastique, long before the Internet and DVDs and special features and things like that, they were covering movies not only as a fan magazine, but as an historical magazine that featured interviews and unique information about the filmmakers. Now, I didn't know really much about Hollywood other than I loved movies and television. I didn't know about the behind the scenes, but I was encouraged by this magazine to start piecing together some of the classic films of the 1950s. Now, when I was a kid, I went to see a movie called Them. Now, Them, if some of your listeners might remember, was a science fiction movie that was released in 1954 about giant ants that invade a New Mexico community and eventually go to Los Angeles. And this happened to be one of the formative films I remember from growing up. And I was able to track down the writer of that movie. I actually had been interviewing him for another thing. My first book when I got out of college was called Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 to 1970. And that was a book about how they made all the great World War II movies. And I had started interviewing those filmmakers, and one of the films I was covering was a movie called Hell to Eternity. Hell to Eternity was released in 1960. It was about an American young American living in Southern California who was raised by Japanese Americans. And he grew to love the Japanese American community. And when they were shipped to the internment camps in 1942, the gentleman whose name was Guy Gabaldon joined the Marines and is responsible for single-handedly capturing over 1,100 Japanese on Saipan in 1944. An extraordinary act. And I always remembered that movie. Jeffrey Hunter played the character, and I remember it was the first movie that gave kind of a human look at the Japanese. And Ted Scherderman wrote that movie, and while we were conversing after the interview, he said it kind of reminded me of something I did on Them. And it struck a chord with me because I said, oh, my God, you wrote Them? And now this is, again, before there was these databases. I had no idea how many films Ted Scherderman had written. So I happened to write a letter to Cinefantastique, which was my little magazine, asking them if he would be interested in an interview with Ted Scherderman. And they were delighted to hear from me. And they asked me if I could track down the director, Gordon Douglas. And then I did something that I think was very, very important strategically for this article. I contacted Warner Brothers, and I asked them if I could use some movie stills that showed the behind-the-scenes making of that film. Mm-hmm. And they invited me over to the studio, and I got to look at their key books, and I selected 3 shots behind the scenes. And when these were published with my article in the magazine, it created kind of a stir. No one had ever seen anybody filming that movie. So it encouraged me to write articles later on Forbidden Planet and The War of the Worlds and The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original version with Michael Rennie, and kind of jump-started my career in the sense of using the tools of an historian to investigate pop culture. Now, I was kind of in the forefront of that. There had been people obviously writing about movies for years, but not as much dissecting the actual films themselves. They were mostly biographies. Right. I started doing that very, very, very intensely, and then I soon realized that I was getting articles and books published, but I wasn't really making any serious money. So I fell into getting a job in public relations. Now, I'd come back from a trip to Europe, and a friend of mine knew I had written some articles. I had actually had a 2-page article published in the LA Times on whatever happened to all the James Bond women. I actually tracked down a number of the women who had played women in James Bond movies, and it got a big 2-page spread in the calendar section, which was a big coup at that time. Mm-hmm. And I walked into a PR agency, and I showed them that, and they were very impressed, and they needed a writer on staff because PR agencies are really needy when it comes to writers, because you write all the biographies, you write all the information packages on various clients. So I got a job in an agency, and talk about a world I had no understanding of. I knew nothing about public relations. I never took marketing classes in college. I had never been exposed to what a publicist was, but here I was in a major Hollywood PR agency getting a chance.
Right. Right. I want to go back to something you said, Steve, because I think it's great in setting up what we'll talk about a little bit later, the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, and that was capturing those, being able to use those behind the scenes from them. And, I mean, where did that fascination come from for the making of the projects that we see? Because a lot of people are just focused on the finished product. What do you think it was back then that made you so interested in the making of projects?
Well, Cinefantastique magazine at that time was known for digging a little deeper than just doing a fan article. They featured interviews, and I had actually, in college, I had been a reporter for my college paper. I went to UCLA. I was a reporter for the UCLA Daily Bruin. So I had started to do some investigative pieces in using interviews, and I think that what happened was I saw an opportunity, having met Mr. Scherderman for my book on combat films, that I saw an opportunity to open up a door into the behind-the-scenes world of movies. And I kind of felt in a lot of ways that I was one of the first people to actually start to interview these people, many of whom said they had never been interviewed, writers, special effects people, art directors, stuntmen. I certainly also reached out to actors as well and directors. But I kind of I was fascinated with how movies were made, and it was kind of, in a way, my film school. A lot of people go to film school to learn how to make movies. My film school was interviewing filmmakers who had made the classics, and whether it was talking to the James Bond women, or I did a major story on the 7 kids who played the the Von Trapp children and The Sound of Music. I tracked them all down for another LA Times piece and got a lot of attention for that as well. I became a little bit of what I called at that time a film archaeologist. I was kind of dusting off these old classic movies and examining how they were made by speaking to the actual participants. And I didn't want to just use information that was available. I tried to reach out to as many people as possible. And the key was they told me fascinating stories. I mean, I did this retrospective on The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, a lot of people respect that movie as being one of the first true classics in the golden age of science fiction of the 1950s. And I got a chance to sit down with Edmund North, who wrote the screenplay. Now, I also knew Edmund North from my World War II book because he wrote Patton, which won him an Oscar with Francis Ford Coppola in 1970. I asked, if you know The Day the Earth Stood Still, Cyrus, there's a very famous scene in that movie where Patricia Neal's in the back of a cab with Michael Rennie, and Michael Rennie is worried that, and he's playing this alien visitor named Klaatu, he's worried what would happen if he gets killed and he has this giant silver robot that can go on the rampage. So he turns to Patricia Neal and he says, you must remember these three words, Klaatu, Barada, Nikto. Klaatu, Barada, Nikto, and she has to remember those words. And indeed, he does get shot, and she's got to go talk to the silver robot. Well, I'm in Edmund North's presence. Of course, I'm going to ask him, what does Klaatu, Barada, Nikto know? Because nobody ever knew, and to this day, most people don't know. And he said, well, in my interpretation, it meant there's hope for Earth if the scientists can be reached. So here I had translated an alien phrase for the first time in history, and I felt like I was Howard Carter digging into King Tut's tomb in Egypt. I felt like I was really, I'd found some unique information. And over the years, I've kind of prided myself on finding little facts and details about our favorite movies. And I continued this to this day. Cinema Fantastique went out of business years ago, but I now write occasionally for a magazine called Cinema Retro. And I actually have an article coming up in the near future. I interviewed Kirk Douglas, who had just turned 100, and we talked about his favorite movie, which is a Western called Lonely Are the Brave. And we had a delightful time. It was the first time I'd ever been in the presence of somebody 100 years old.
Wow. Wow, amazing. We're going to pick up that conversation. Steve, I want to say for those who are just tuning in, he's on the radio side of Online. You're listening to Conversations Live. We're speaking with Steve Rubin today. Steve's not only a producer and author, as we've heard us talking about here, but also a pop culture historian. We're talking with him not only about his beginnings, but also what it's been like for him to be recognized for the work that he does. So, I mean, speaking of that recognition, Steve, is that part of the satisfaction? Because it seems as though, as we've said earlier, you genuinely love what you do. Is it just a great side effect that you're able to also not only be recognized for it, but also be able to do this, as we said earlier, you know, as part of your livelihood?
Well, all writers have egos. Most of us write in a little room, you know, with a window, and we spend, in the case with my book, The TWILIGHT Zone Encyclopedia, I spent 3 years on this project. And there's not a lot of money involved in writing books. I mean, you make some money, certainly. It's certainly not going to make your living. But it's certainly wonderful when you hear from people that they love your work. And I take great pleasure in hearing from people either on my Facebook accounts or LinkedIn or Twitter or in person. It's just wonderful to see that I kind of get them interested in film history, just like my history teacher used to do back in high school, trying to tell me about George Washington and the Civil War, just trying to get some interest going in the history of our nation. I actually I try to do the same thing with my writing, and it's wonderful to hear from people. It's also a little bit of it kind of validates you. You can work on these projects, and sometimes if nobody pays any attention to you, you wonder why are you doing this? And I've gotten tremendous reaction. In fact, when I wrote that article on The Day the Earth Stood Still, I got a fan letter from Leonard Maltin. And Leonard Maltin is a really respected film critic in the world, and I've known about his books for years. In fact, his book, he was the first person who literally published a paperback book that listed every major movie and had a little review of it and told me who the people were in it. And Leonard telling me that he really loved my article on Day the Earth Stood Still was very, very important for me.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned Leonard, Steve. That's a great segue back to the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. He was one of those who gave you a blurb for the new book. I mean, how does that feel to have something like this, as you mentioned, that you spent a few years of your life with, already being recognized by people that you have such respect for?
It's terrific. I mean, there's a small cadre of people in Hollywood who are kind of the keepers of the flame. They kind of, they're the ones who remember the history from all the way back to silent era, and they talk about it, they write about it, and in many ways they're interviewed on camera, and we kind of preserve history just like a Shakespearean scholar continually reinvestigates how Shakespeare wrote, or a painting expert, an art historian will constantly analyze the work of a Van Gogh. I mean, it's kind of our duty to preserve this history for future generations, and I think that in this kind of world where everything is accessible and there's constant information and media overload, I think it's sometimes important to just kind of take a breath and think about how things were back in the 1950s and how they did stuff. And it influences you in many ways. As a filmmaker, not only did I write the book, The Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, but I'm writing screenplays now which are inspired by Rod Serling. I mean, his whole thing was letting your imagination go to infinity and beyond. I mean, and when The Twilight Zone debuted in 1959, no one had ever seen a show like that before. There had been anthologies, and there certainly had been science fiction anthologies, but never from an award-winning writer like Rod Serling. I mean, he comes to California with 3 Emmys under his belt and a tremendous reputation. In fact, Mike Wallace, who interviewed him on camera before the show debuted, thought he was slumming. Science fiction wasn't respected in those days. It was kind of something that was exploited on the drive-in circuit.
Right. That brings up an interesting question, Steve. I mean, here we are in 2017, and there's so much that's out there when it comes to content that people are doing, taking advantage of a lot of the technology that's out there. Does it surprise you, or does it not surprise you that in 2017 that the Twilight Zone still continues to have the audience it does, especially like on stations like Sci-Fi where it plays the marathons every day? Does that surprise you, or do you feel as though because it is such a great show that it would have that longevity?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because I think people gravitate to the good stuff. I mean, in terms of pop culture and media, good material stays fresh. I mean, it applies to, movies like the James Bond movies. I mean, it's a long-running successful series. It applies to Star Wars. It applies to television as well. And I think that good television then works today as well. Now, interestingly, for a new generation, it's been a bit of a challenge because I have a teenage son, and it took me a while to get him interested in a black and white show. I mean, it kind of felt like he was watching ancient history here, and as he started to watch the Twilight Zone episodes, he became intrigued because they're that good. I mean, the concept of a 30-minute anthology telling these succinct little stories that had twists and unusual settings was just fascinating then, and it's still fascinating. Also, I think another thing that Rod Serling did is he decided to tell the stories about ordinary people like you could have sitting next to you on the bus, or people who you worked with. It could happen to anybody, and because of that, you kind of put yourself in these episodes. Like, what would I do if I was sitting in a bus station one night late and I saw somebody out of the corner of my eye who looked just like me? And I would begin to wonder, who is that person? And, that, of course, is a wonderful episode called The Mirror Image with Vera Miles. And, these little stories continue to resonate. And I've also said recently that, we study the classics in school. We study Hemingway, we study Fitzgerald, we study Edgar Allan Poe. And these are all great writers of history, Mark Twain, etc. But I would maintain that the work of Rod Serling and his team of writers from 1959 and 1964 much more relatable to today's audience in the stories they tell. And I think that it would be good for classrooms around the country to study his work, because I've tried to, like all of us, I've tried to wade through F. Scott Fitzgerald and some of these other authors, and they I just didn't find it that appealing. But I could see myself studying the work of Rod Serling very easily.
Yeah. And I would say this, too. One of the things that, I'm one of those individuals who loves to watch, which is why I know it's so sci-fi. I love to watch the marathons, especially this time of year during the holidays. They play them quite a bit as well. I also think, you see really a who's who in these as well, right? Like William Shatner. I can remember an episode, or two with him being featured in them. So there you do see people that you recognize, that are still active today. Do you think that also is part of the staying power, the credibility that added to that show, Steve, being able to have individuals that were respected in their field being a part of that franchise?
Absolutely. I think that the Twilight Zone, and part of the reason I did the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia is I wanted to make sure those faces were recognized, not only the star faces like the Robert Redfords and the Charles Bronsons, the James Coburns, the Burt Reynolds, who were at the beginnings of their career, but some of the older faces too, who were solid, kind of salt of the earth character actors like Burgess Meredith, who a lot of older, actually younger audiences will remember him as Rocky's trainer, and then Jack Klugman, who was on Quincy all those years, and The Odd Couple, and James Whitmore, James Whitmore from them back in the day, but became a wonderful actor in more recent films like The Shawshank Redemption. Yeah. Those actors need to get the attention because they were really the wonderful kaleidoscope of acting color that was on that show. And, I have wonderful memories of these actors and how they appeared, and I wanted to maintain them for history. But you're absolutely right in the fact that it's nice to see familiar faces. I do a daily blog. I'm doing it for a year. It's called This Day in Twilight Zone History. I do it on Facebook. I have a dedicated site called the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. I do it on LinkedIn. I do it on Twitter. And today I was just noting that it is the day that we lost Bill Bixby. Now, a lot of people remember Bill Bixby from a show called My Favorite Martian back in the day. He was also one of the first people, if not the first person, to play Dr. Banner in The Incredible Hulk. But Bill Bixby, on one of his first things he ever did, he's in a 1-hour Twilight Zone episode called The 30 Fathom Grave. So I had a chance to honor him today. It was the day that he passed back in 1993. And it's just wonderful to see these young actors early in their careers.
Right. I think that's so true. Again, everyone, Steve Rubin is our guest. His newest project is called the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. We're going to remind you all here in a bit how you can get the book for yourself and stay connected with Steve, including with what you just heard him talk about, what he's able to do with his blogging work as well. So, Steve, for those who are just now finding out about the book, what is it your hope that it does for them? Because you even say, I think, in the beginning of the book, whether you are new to the Twilight Zone or have been a fan of it for quite some time, you believe they'll get something from it. So what is it that you hope that they do take away from the new book?
It's not a book you read cover to cover. It's a book you look at as a companion to when you watch the shows or want to refer to, having a question. I packed this book with plenty of facts. I actually made a note in one of my opening remarks that I like to read footnotes in history books sometimes, because sometimes the footnotes are even more interesting than the text. My book is kind of a book of footnotes. It's about I kind of dig down into each of the episodes. I give you as much behind-the-scenes information as I could find, and then I tell you a little bit about these performers and where they came from and where they went. So you have a little bit of a sense of who a James Whitmore is. I mean, James Whitmore, for most young people, they have no clue who this guy is. But when you start to look at the roles he took and the wonderful role he had in the Twilight Zone episode on Thursday We Leave for Home, which was one of the 1 hours, you begin to understand how wonderful an actor he was. And then, of course, going back to those movie stills and the love I had finding the rare ones, I packed the book with over 400 pictures. So you have more photographs from the Twilight Zone than anybody's ever put in a book, and some of them are unusual. That 30 Fathom Grave episode I just mentioned that had Bill Bixby in it, I went to the U.S. Navy and I actually got a picture of the actual destroyer that was featured in that episode. And, I did things like that. I found little bits and pieces of interesting kind of trivia that fans will relate to. So it's a fun book, and it's an accessible book because it's an A to Z. So if you're interested in reading about Burgess Meredith, you just go to M and you'll find Burgess Meredith. Or if you want to talk about the episode that he starred in, Time Enough at Last, you go to T. And then I have all the casts. I have the original Rod Serling introductions to each episode. And then I actually licensed from a fellow journalist Rod Serling's last interview. So Rod Serling is alive in the book just a few months before he passed.
Wow. So lots of people can take away from it. Again, the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia, available through our friends at Amazon.com. And Steve, how can our audience stay connected with you as well as be able to take advantage of the daily blog?
Thank you. I have on Facebook every day the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia page. If you get on that, you don't have to subscribe to it, as far as I know. I think you just have to join it, and I'll give you that blog every day. And then I also have my own Facebook page under Stephen J. Rubin. That's StevenJayrubin, and that's also my Facebook page. I don't have an up and running website right now, but the best way to stay in touch with me is probably through Facebook.
Gotcha. So make sure you're doing that. Steve, again, congratulations to you, and thank you so much for the time, and looking forward to having you back on the program again.
I loved it, Cyrus. Thank you, and have a happy holiday season.
You do the same thing. And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Conversations Live. If you all came in late and missed part of the conversation with Steve, don't worry. Thanks to our online friends, you all can catch the replay right after we go off the air. The link is already available through our social media site, so head over to facebook.com/CyrusWebb or go to twitter.com/CyrusWebb. You can click on the link there. You can listen to the show completely for free and share it with your friends from there, too. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb, saying, as always, enjoy your day, enjoy your life, enjoy your world. Make sure you take out time to enjoy some good music as well as a great book. Thank you all for choosing Conversations Live today. You all make it a great one.